Like all of Bach's passions and many of his cantatas, the B minor Mass begins with a big panoramic movement. Despite the extreme brevity of the text being set, only the words Kyrie eleison, Bach spins an elaborate and expansive movement that lasts between 9 and 10 minutes in most performances. When Bach submitted the Kyrie and Gloria of the Mass in B minor to the Elector of Saxony in 1733 as an audition for the position of Kapellmeister, the score was filed in the Elector's library, but not added to the performance repertoire of the court chapel. The great length of the work, and of this first movement in particular, was likely the reason. Apparently, the Elector's HR department took one look at this job application and said, "Overqualified." The movement begins with an appropriately solemn and dramatic tutti. For decades, I assumed that this 4-bar homophonic introduction did no more than establish the key, tempo, and tone of the movement that follows. What more does it need to do, after all? But finally, curiosity made me look for a closer connection, some shared musical material, perhaps. And lo and behold, this is what I found. How did I miss it all these years? The bass line of the introduction is the fugue subject in outline. Virtually every pitch of the bass line is a principal note in the fugue subject, bar for bar, as shown by the vertical arrows between the two in the example. Furthermore, the two bass notes that create the portentous half-close of the introduction, G and F sharp, are the pitches of the sigh motif that is such a significant feature of the fugue subject. And those same pitches appear all over the introduction, both horizontally and vertically, as shown in rectangular boxes. Additionally, the melodic tritone that appears in the fugue subject occurs numerous times in the introduction, certainly more times than you'd expect to see this troublesome interval, which is usually avoided in classical voice leading. After the introduction and a pregnant pause, the music begins again, but now with just the instruments and quietly as if embarking on the narration of some epic story. They present us with a melody that is gentle, thoughtful, exploratory, solemn, sad, intense, a melody that in musical terms really begins at the beginning with a single pitch repeated 4 times and then a single upward step. Like the step that begins the proverbial journey of 1,000 miles, this musical step is the basis of all melody, and Bach's melody goes on to demonstrate just that, incorporating a proliferation of half-steps and whole steps, rising steps and falling steps. As seen from the line of notations below the staff in the example, the distance between steps increases from a 4th to a 5th to a 6th, and finally to that most expressive of intervals, a 7th. These ever-widening intervals seem to represent the idea of a journey or a search, or of striving after some goal. Initially, the melody is constantly changing direction, but from the 2nd bar on, even as the melody reaches for higher and higher notes, downward motion becomes more prevalent overall. Robert Shaw certainly felt that this melody symbolized humanity's search for meaning, or its striving for immortality, or perfection, or all of the above. He noted that its upward yearnings, the rising step B to C sharp, and the rising half steps C sharp to D and D sharp to E, are symbolically held back by the repeated falling half step G to F sharp. And he brilliantly pointed out that the highest notes attained by all this symbolic striving are the very same pitches, displaced by an octave, as the ones that are holding it down, G and F sharp. For Shaw, this symbolized the idea that even as we humans achieve our greatest triumphs, we are forced to confront our limitations. Whatever argument Bach was making with these Gs and F sharps, he certainly drives it home at the end of the movement, like an ancient Greek orator at the peroration of his discourse, or a Baptist preacher of more modern times at the climax of his sermon. He lays the repetitions on thick at the end. In the final 8 measures, I count 27 paired Gs and F sharps, or F sharps and Gs, including, in the third last bar, a harmonically significant one in the bass, a melodically climactic one in the soprano, and an octave displaced one, very athletic one, in the altos, which is the first link in an almost literal chain of 4 pairs. Here's how these pairs sound in isolation from the texture, with their eventual resolution. Let's return now to our consideration of the subject of this fugue. This theme is notable also for its use of the so-called Neapolitan sixth or flat 2 chord, which in the context of B minor is the chord of C major. Baroque and classical composers almost always associated the Neapolitan sixth chord with overt emotion, usually great sorrow or anguish, and tended to use it sparingly, either in setting a particularly poignant word in the text or for an especially dolorous effect at a cadence. But here, Bach makes the flat 2 chord an intrinsic part of the main theme of a 9-minute movement, to be heard almost every time that theme is stated. The first statement of the subject is answered in the dominant in the manner of a standard fugal exposition, but then follows a long passage which extends and tonicizes the key of F-sharp minor, not what we would expect in a fugal exposition. Indeed, as the movement continues, it exhibits a distinct tendency to linger at cadences, extending some of them to a length of 4 or 5 measures, something rare and atypical in a fugue, but predictable and frequent in a ritornello form movement. Presumably, Bach realized that unabated forward momentum, of the kind that might be highly desirable in a 2 or 3 minute long fugue, was not sustainable in a piece that was to last 9 minutes or more. It should be remembered that at this time in music history, the maximum length of a single movement in a work of any sort was about 5 minutes, so a piece almost twice that long was uncharted territory for a Baroque composer. Bach seems to have felt that what was needed in a work of that duration were passages of harmonic repose long enough to whet listeners' appetites for further harmonic excursions. That was precisely the element that was absent from the makeup of a fugue, but present in ritornello-based music. Both forms had thematic passages, utilizing unidirectional harmonic motion, the subject, the Fortesatz, and sequential passages featuring complex harmonic motion, the episode, the Fortspinnung. But only ritornello forms had those leisurely tonic extensions known as epilogues. However, the concertante style was too insubstantial and unserious for the first movement of a mass, certainly a mass as grand as this. So it seems that Bach decided to organize Kyrie I according to the most useful principles from both structural models. The degree to which he succeeded in this experiment can be gauged by the frequency with which listeners emit sighs of satisfaction after hearing it performed. When two styles or genre are fused in this way, some characteristic features of each will necessarily be lost or distorted in accommodating the other. For instance, it can easily be seen from this chart that 2 of the sections labeled Fortesatz, V, are out of all proportion with the other ritornello sections. This is owing to the fugal necessity of giving all 5 voice parts their own opportunity to carry the subject, and the presence of 2 additional entries on top of that. Yet the 7 appearances of the subject, because they basically all move from tonic to dominant and all state a single theme, have only one functional parallel within the ritornello concept, and that is the Fortesatz. The figures in the right-hand margin of the table are a tally of the appearances of the subject. There are 11 in the first half of the piece, but only 10 in the second half. What would have been the third entry of the instrumental interlude, were it fully symmetrical with the instrumental introduction, is omitted, so that the entry of the choral basses has to do double or triple duty in a sense, furnishing the opening entry of the second choral exposition, the final entry of the interlude, and the epilogue of the Ritornello that began in measure 73 all at once. Why would Bach decrease the number of subjects in the second half by 1? An omission of 4 bars from a total of 126 is not significant as an edit for brevity, and all it does is rob the movement of what could have been a perfect symmetry between its two halves. I feel the answer lies in the careful attention Bach tended to pay to numerological matters in his music. 11 plus 10 equals 21, a very auspicious number, being comprised of digits that add up to 3, the number of the divine, and being a multiple of 3 and 7, the number of completeness. 11 plus 11, however, since it totals 1 more than the auspicious 21, would have been an inauspicious number, and one that Bach would likely have avoided. Of those 21 entries, 8 are in B minor, 10 are in F sharp minor, 1 is in C sharp minor, and 1 is in E minor. Just 1 is in A major, and in fact the 3 measures in which the instruments play that A major version of the subject are the only measures in the entire piece, prior to the concluding Tierce de Picardie, that venture into the major mode. I think it is telling that Bach gives the only major version of the subject to the instruments. I suspect he didn't want the singers to utter the phrase, "Lord have mercy," in a sunny, smiling A major. This consideration may also have had something to do with his decision not to cast the movement as a standard fugue, because once you get beyond the exposition of a standard fugue based on a minor subject, you would expect to hear the subject in major at least a couple of times. Instead, he restricted the fugal elements of the piece to a mini-exposition and a final entry by the orchestra alone, and an extended exposition and final entry by orchestra and chorus together, both of which are repeated, the orchestral one in truncated form, as we have noted, in the second half. Note the clever way Bach reuses the same keys for the first 4 entries in the second choral exposition as in the first choral exposition, yet with a totally different effect. What were the high voice entries the first time around are assigned an octave lower to low voices the second time around, and vice versa. The basses enter first in a distinctly basement-y register. The tenors follow in a range where the low notes of the subject are actually a bit hard for them to produce. Then the altos enter, pitched so low that full-on chest voice is the only option. Next come the soprano ones, whose subject sits low enough that it dips below the tenor part at one point. The 5th entry on this second go-round breaks from the original key scheme. By bringing the 5th voice in E minor this time, Bach sets up a return to the home key of B minor that is fairly climactic, particularly after the exceptionally low tessitura of the preceding entries. Note also that the instruments do not merely double the voices in the choral passages. Bach composes a different instrumental accompaniment for each of the choral expositions, measures 30 to 46 and 81 to 92, and adds independent instrumental parts to the choral episode in measures 58 to 61, which reappear transposed and inverted in measures 112 to 115. One last comment about this movement. Right at the outset, there's a notable occurrence of the Bach motif, the pitches that the Germans call B, A, C, and H, which we call B flat, A, C, and B natural. I can't take credit for discovering it. The British Bach scholar Malcolm Boyd discovered this one. It is misspelled, the B flat being notated as an A sharp, but right there in the first 2 bars of the whole work, using the very first chromatic notes in the piece, Bach signs his name. What's more, the signature is embedded in such a terrific chord progression that it more than justifies its presence.